I believe that by next summer, you will see significant improvements in security. Forces will continue to flow for about a little more than a year until they all arrive. By this time next year, 1 year from now, I believe I'll be able to tell you that the strategy is clearly working and will be successful.
General Stanley McChrystal is here. He was commander of the International Security Assistance Force and the United States forces in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. He also played a key role in Iraq as commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. He was instrumental in the capture of Saddam Hussein and the killing of Abu Massad Zarqawi. His memoir, My Share of the Task, has just been released in paperback. It comes at a time when both Iraq and Afghanistan are facing renewed and violent insurgencies. I'm pleased to have Stanley McChrystal back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate it.
We want to talk about many things, including where you are today and where you're going forward, but also look back at where you have some advantage of experience and insight. Afghanistan. Where are we in your judgment on the ground there as they prepare to leave most troops by 2014 and maybe all?
Yeah, I think we're in a sensitive period in Afghanistan, but then, of course, in the last 15 years, what hasn't been? I think that militarily or security-wise, there's been a lot of gains made. Yeah. And those gains are shown on the ground in the relative life of the people. I think in terms of government, there's been great problems. Internal to the Afghan government, there's been a real difficulty in getting local governance, adequate, competent local administration, technocrats down to low levels, which builds confidence of the people. And then at the national level, there's been a problem with them being able to be a credible national government. I don't think that's impossible for them, but it's been a challenge. And then the third, which I think people forget sometimes, is I think the Afghan people have moved to a different place. I think that particularly young people, not just those in school we talk so much about, but those who maybe have graduated from school, and Afghan females and a lot of other Afghans are not ready to go back in time. They're not ready to go back to pre-9/11. They're not ready to go back to 1990. They're not ready to go back to 1978. So when people talk about Afghanistan and what will happen in the future, and they immediately pull out a history book and they say, this is what will happen, I think it's a different Afghanistan. Now, they're still fraught with dangers because that political weakness could break into violence in the groups. I don't think the Taliban can take over. I just don't think they're strong enough. But I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and the Afghan people are plagued by that what happens next question.
What mistakes did the United States and its allies make in Afghanistan?
A number. I think that I'm going to include Afghans in our allies. Sure. If we go back just to 9/11 and we say that we went in sort of unexpectedly after the al-Qaeda elements that were there, we suddenly found ourselves having toppled the Taliban government without really having thought, what next? Now we have a country that had been through about 20 years of war at that point. It was badly damaged, had very little infrastructure or personal capital into human capital in terms of putting against governance and whatnot. And we thought that we could do things more cheaply than we did. We thought we could say that the Germans would do the police, the Italians would do the courts, the Americans would do the army, and a few other things, and we would slide out. And that just wasn't realistic. It was going to take a much bigger international effort. And in our haste and sometimes our ignorance, we allowed a number of what I call non-traditional leaders, warlords in many cases, people to gather economic, political, and sometimes military power. We allowed them to get into places sometimes where they'd been before. And what that signaled to the Afghan population is that here we go again. We are going back to a bad old days that really was what preceded the Taliban. So the Afghan people said, well, we're just leaving the Taliban period. The danger is we're going to go back to what we hated about that pre-Taliban period. So I think we lost confidence amongst many Afghans during that 2001 to 2004 period. The Taliban saw opportunity. They came back in and they said, look, what's happening? You're going back to the bad old days, and the Americans are not going to solve your problem. And they started to find fertile ground, not initially in huge places, but slowly. And so they were able to grow up their political power and in some cases military. And so we made mistakes in not seeing that happen early enough, not reacting to it strongly enough when we did. We were under-resourced in many ways, but probably most we were under-resourced in understanding. We didn't study the problem enough. We didn't learn the language enough. We didn't take a long-term, truly consistent, focused approach to it.
We did not leave a residual force there. Do you believe if there had been a residual force of perhaps 10,000 people or more, soldiers, that we would not see the conflict we see today?
There's no way to guarantee that, but I think that chances are that we would have had a better situation there now. I think the demonstration of continued partnership with the government of Iraq could have been a factor that would have given the Sunnis more confidence that they were going to have an ability to be more fairly.
And perhaps we would have been able to persuade the Prime Minister of that as well.
We certainly lost a terrific amount of our leverage with the Prime Minister when we were gone. Now, I understand the desire to be gone, but I think that it also signaled to the region that we had touched the stove and it was too hot and we were going to withdraw our hands. And I think that while we don't want to stay places with huge numbers of people, we must stay engaged in parts of the world.
If we had left a residual force, what would they have done?
I think that most likely they would have largely done training, professionalization of Iraqi forces, logistics, support, and things. But to a certain degree, they would have also been a demonstrated commitment, a demonstrated partnership.
But if you look at Iraq, the president prepared to negotiate to keep a residual force there. It wasn't like we didn't want to have one. It was the negotiations, as I understand it, were unsuccessful.
That's my understanding as well. And of course...
And they may be unsuccessful in Afghanistan as well.
They may be indeed.
And then you have the reality that the Iraqi foreign minister is saying to the Afghans, don't make the mistake we did and not keep some Americans there. But they may. Which brings me to this question. You were one of the people who had a relationship with Hamid Karzai. I don't understand him. I don't understand why, after all this, he still seems, either he's just purely political and perhaps corrupt, or likely corrupt, and yet, after all that America has done, and he wouldn't be in power without America, he seems so resentful.
There's a saying that says that give somebody something and the first person they hate is you. And Bob Comer wrote a paper near the end of the Vietnam War that said the paradox of counterinsurgency is the client state that you are helping soon finds itself less committed to it than you do. The donor cares more than the recipient. I think that in the case of Afghanistan, there's a number of things at work here. First, I think many of the Afghan people are trying to come to grips with what they think is imminent abandonment. Right. And I think that many of them are trying to steel themselves that we are going to leave, so they are emotionally and physically prepared for that.
Because it has happened before.
That's correct. I think President Karzai, and I certainly wouldn't presume to do a psychological study, but I think that if you see his relationship with the United States, it's underpinned with some very practical things. He doesn't want to be portrayed as a puppet as part of his people. Man. That's right. He also thinks that in the future Afghanistan, he is going to have to be very independent and therefore not have to dance to our fiddle. On the other hand, he's also had enough of a painful relationship where over what is now many years, this is from 2001, it's a long time to operate out of a palace where it's very difficult for him to travel. It's a long time to be going through this endless cycle of ISAF commanders and American interlocutors from department or from secretaries of state to generals to ambassadors, and to find that in many cases he thinks that he hasn't been listened to or hasn't been respected. And
respect is a big thing.
It is. It's a huge thing. And I think that if you sort of look at that, and over time he gets increasingly frustrated with that, and he's human. In my the Hamid Karzai I knew was a good man, and he was a rational man, but he was a human, and he had all the frustrations and responses that other people.
So how did you, as the general who came to see him, give us the secret of, or at least your own sense of how you should engage him by showing him the respect, by trying to gain his confidence, by trying to disavow him of his worst instincts?
Yeah. And I certainly have no secret, and I think it's just dealing with people. The first thing I did was view him as an elected leader of a nation, not as a client of the United States that worked for me or was dependent upon us. He was a sovereign leader of a nation. And when I first went to see him the first time, it was not tradition for Americans to be in anything but our battle uniform. But I took my dress green uniform for my first meeting with him. I dressed in that and went to see him, which was my attempt to show him special respect and to almost like I was presenting my credentials as I was an arriving person. I also tried to communicate to him that this was not only his nation, this was his war, and that I was the commander of NATO troops, but in reality, I was supporting the Afghan army's fight for the war. Now, he had never viewed it as their war. He'd viewed the war in Afghanistan as something that they were reluctantly allowing the West to fight on their territory because it benefited them, but they didn't like that. And what I tried to do was convince him this is a war for national survival, and it's your war. And you have got to take the role as commander-in-chief in doing that. I don't claim that we got all the way to that, but I made efforts to establish that. There were times that I'm sure that he would have liked me to do differently than I did, and there were times when I liked him to do differently than he did. But I believe that by working as hard as we did on the relationship, there were also times when we each did differently than our instincts might have been to maintain the relationship. And the goal was to strengthen that to the point where he trusted me as a person, and he trusted me as a military commander, and I could be a good support for the other natural interlocutors, the ambassador, our Secretary of State, our president, and whatnot, as they did policy level.
And you have to overlay all of this that there's never been a strong central government in Afghanistan ever. Yeah. You know, I mean, the tribal areas have their own leadership, and that makes the central government's task that much stronger. I mean, more challenging.
That's right. If you're President Karzai, you don't have a political party. You don't have this automatic base of support. You are trying to triangulate between a number of different interests and the foreigners, the West being an interest, and the Taliban, interestingly enough, being an interest. You're trying to balance between all of these, not going so far to one that the others become enemies.
What is it, the 3 or 4 things that you think is essential to communicate to the young people of Yale, or if you were asked to come to West Point or to Annapolis and Air Force Academy and say the same thing to future military leaders?
Absolutely. First off, and I'll keep it fairly focused on things associated with war. The first is we tend to think of war, and sometimes we say we're going to conquer a piece of ground or we're going to do something that seems very physical. War is about people. War is won in people's minds. It's one, the army that wins is the one that thinks it won. The one that loses is the one that thinks it's losing or has lost. And the population decides which side wins. And that's very counterintuitive when you try to take an empirical look at war. So that's the first thing. It's about people. And so to the degree you are not just moving stuff, you are influencing people. The second is we say the general must have, or military leaders must have a great strategy. In reality, I've come to believe you can do strategy pretty quickly. You and I could sit here in an hour and come out with a workable strategy.
Yeah.
The genius is implementing it. And to implement it means you've got to do a number of things. First, you've got to articulate it clearly, constantly, and have it understood. People have got to believe that you are absolutely committed to it and that you will provide the kind of focus. If you state your strategy different every day, they wait till the next day to hear one they like, and they withhold action. They've got to believe it's consistent commitment. They have got to believe that they are part of it. You've got to convince people, your soldiers, your civilians, and the people, that this is a strategy that they not only will benefit from, but they must contribute to. So they don't want to see General McChrystal's strategy. They want to see our strategy, and they have to accept that. So it becomes a people exercise at every level. Then I think the last I'd say is it is about building trust. If there's anything I've come to believe, and I go back and I look at, the 2004 Dream Team, you say, I'm going to build a great team. And so you say, I'm going to go get great talent, and I'm going to put this talent together. That does not equal a great team. A great team does have a component of talent, but the other component is what I call shared consciousness, which is a combination of trust, common purpose, and informed contextual understanding. So together, this entity believes in the same thing and understands, is informed enough to do that well. Then you put those together, and suddenly you have the necessary ingredients to have a truly effective team. If you build a great team and reinforce that, you can do just about anything. If you don't focus on that team part, no matter how brilliant the strategy is, you're likely not to do
As we saw with that first Dream Team.
Exactly.
And they changed with the second Dream Team because of a different coach.
Exactly.
Let me talk about Bob Gates' book for a second and get your take on this. This idea first was that the president, who supported the surge, and that you had recommended from the field some different levels of troops that might be necessary. I've forgotten where, 70,000 to 50, whatever the numbers were, and you know them. And then there had been much debate, and the president talked and listened to a lot of people. And then there was the leak of a memo from some people thought it came from you or people around you because they wanted to, quote, make the case publicly for what they felt they needed to do the job. Who leaked the memo? And do you think it had a devastating impact or a significant impact on the relationship between the president and his generals in the field, especially you?
Yeah. I know that I didn't leak it, and I am almost 100% sure nobody on my staff did. We had started work on that in June. We'd finished it in early August. We'd been told not to submit it until September, which is when we submitted it. And then it was back in D.C. for about 3 weeks, and then it leaked. And we had no reason to leak it because, in fact, once it was leaked, it made my job and our job much harder. We were much better to have the president and his team with a chance to digest it. So I absolutely think that the speculation that we leaked it is completely incorrect. I don't know who did leak it, and someday somebody may say.
Would you want to know, or not very much?
Not very much at this point. I think any of these leaks. Yeah. These leaks are so damaging because what they do is they undercut trust. They change. The debate should have been about what was in the assessment. The discussion should have been about, because I gave the assessment in two pieces. The first piece was the assessment that said, here's the situation, here's what we have to do if we want to succeed. And I didn't put anything about troops in there. I said, you must change the way we fight this war or we will fail. If you accept this assessment, if you accept these conclusions, then look at Part 2, which we gave about 2 weeks later, I think. And Part 2 said, these are the resources required, but don't do the resourcing if you don't believe this first part, because it'll be good money after bad. And so as we did this, we were very careful to try to make sure that people understood we weren't giving a judgment on the war. I told my staff, think of ourselves as auto mechanics. We don't own the car, but we've been asked to say what it would take to get the car in running order. Try to be dispassionate and give this assessment. And I think we did a very, very effective job of that.
Do you recognize the fact that the president felt like he was being boxed in by the military?
I do. I'll be honest, at the time I did not. Yeah. When I got to Afghanistan in June, I developed our mission statement based upon the president's earlier statements and speeches, and I thought was absolutely in line with what he had said, and I believe we were. I was not aware of the depth of the relooking of the overall commitment to Afghanistan. And so when I submitted the assessment and there started to be this tremendous discussion, I was late to understanding the depth of that. I thought we were discussing how we were going to execute the president's mission, but instead the discussion had shifted
to what the mission ought to be.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then there was a question and answer in London after you made a speech, which didn't help matters.
No, it did not.
But Bob Gates has said, and sometimes it seems to me he's been misunderstood in part, that the president sent men and women into battle without supporting the mission. That seems to be not true, and that's what Bob Gates said. It was not true. But the president did, as you would think a commander-in-chief would do, ask questions, and to be skeptical. Is this working? But if it's working, how do you explain this? I would hope that a commander-in-chief, in fact, I would hope a general would say that to his lieutenants, would you not?
Yes, and I actually thought the assessment process in the fall was healthy because it really did force the discussion. Now, not all parts of it were comfortable or done as perfectly, but I thought that level of focus on what are we trying to do and what's it going to take to do it was very healthy.
Bob Gates says he supported all the president's decisions with respect to Afghanistan. Did you?
Yes. I would not have recommended. I was asked whether I recommended announcing a July 11 beginning of pulling forces out. But I told him, he asked me point blank, can you accept that? And I said, yes, I could. And I could, and I still can.
Everybody is trying to understand the president and leadership on a whole range of domestic and foreign issues. Give me your sense of him, from your contact with him as a leader, as a commander-in-chief, and as a president.
Of course, I have a very limited aperture on the president. What I found was he had thought very analytically about Afghanistan from the beginning, from when he took the presidency in January of 2009. He thought about it. I think he was frustrated because as he was trying to understand it, he was being given a drumbeat of decisions that had to be made before he'd had time to completely internalize what the situation was. And so I think he was being asked to make another commitment first, almost the day he took over. And so I think that caused great frustration. And what that did was it caused him to be skeptical of the information he was getting and whether people were trying to push him too fast. And of course, the problem is events on the battlefield, push that. I think the next part is I think he, and I'm speculating on this, but I think he had a natural lack of familiarity with how the military works. Anyone would. That is not a criticism. Anyone who deals with a different culture or group of people, it takes a while to get that. If you're doing it really sort of for the first time as the President of the United States, you're not only trying to feel more comfortable with that culture, but you're doing it as their commander. And so I think he was trying very hard to balance the fact that he had responsibilities as a commander, his loyalty and leadership. Military have a demeanor that they develop over many years. We wear uniforms that overtly describe where we've been, what we've done, what our rank is, and whatnot. And in some ways, we benefit from the fact it looks impressive and people can ooh and ah. And sometimes when you enter a room, you get more respect than you, as an individual, have earned. So we sometimes use that persona. We feel comfortable in it. But at the same time, it creates a divide between us and other people. And we pay a price for that. And we are partly to blame for the fact that we benefit on the one hand, but we don't pay as much respect to the negative sides of that as we could.
General Odiarna was here, and he said to me one thing that interests me. I asked him this question, and I want to have you tell me how you see it, too, that questions have power. And he said that we often ask the wrong questions. In Iraq, he was talking about. I mean, in your own experience, have been cases in which you asked the wrong question and therefore couldn't get to the right answer?
Repeatedly. And Ray's exactly right. When we started the fight against al-Qaeda in Iraq, I was a tactically focused guy. And so the first question I wanted to know is, where are the enemy? And then as we got a little more experienced, we started to say, now, wait a minute, what is the enemy doing? That's a high-level, thoughtful question. And then we said, no, that's really not the answer. The next answer, really, we want to know is who's the enemy? What's the makeup of them? Where do they come from? What are they? And that wasn't really even the right question. The right question was why is the enemy? Why is there an enemy? What is causing people to join this organization? What is causing them to do it? But it took us almost like walking through freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, and senior year before you get to the problem. Because if you don't understand the root of this, you're going to be dealing with the symptoms forever.
Navy SEALs. I'm going to talk about that later in this hour as well. Tell me about how you see Navy SEALs and what they represent, and what kind of person comes out of that training.
Sure. And I'm going to expand it to include the special operators I worked with. So the Navy SEALs were part of them.
Right.
Other special operations units. They are pretty unique. The first is they have decided to volunteer for a more difficult but a more elite type of service. And I think in many cases it's because what they're really looking for is to belong to something that challenges them as individuals, but allows them to sit at a table with people they admire and be considered an equal. And that's a very addictive feeling if you're suddenly around people that would otherwise be your heroes and they look at you as somebody that they respect. So it's a draw to be in that. C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful article, The Inner Ring. It's a little bit of the desire to be in the innermost ring. They are willing to pay a price in terms of how hard it is, how much time away, and whatnot, because being part of that very, very elite organization fulfills in them some needs. They are headstrong. Often. You can't lead them the same way you lead conventional troops. You've got to engage them. In fact, the best way I found to engage really good special operators was not to tell them what to do, but to describe a problem. To say, I've got this problem. Do you think it can be solved? And they look at it and they go, well, we think we could. And you say, how would you do that? They describe it. And then you say, would you be willing to do that? And even though it might be a very, very dangerous mission. And then they make the call. And whatever.
What are you training? Are you training, is it toughness of mind?
Yeah. It's problem solving. And it is problem solving not just from a logical sense, but from an emotional sense. If you give me a problem and you say, solve that problem, and you give me a bunch of things I can't do or limits and resources, then I can come back and say, I can't do it, I don't have enough money, I don't have time, you name it. And I got a crutch and I just go on and we stay mediocre. I had a boss, Bill Garrison, who commanded JSOC in Mogadishu. Wonderful guy. We sat in an after-action review one time, and the communications in an aircraft hadn't worked. And he said, I want it fixed. And he's got a bunch of really mealy-mouthed answers. And he said, now, wait a minute. Listen. Whatever equipment you have to buy, I'll buy for you. Whatever experts you have to hire to come in and train, I'll do. Whatever other exercises you need to do, I will schedule. No excuses. No constraints, no excuses. And suddenly you take away from people the idea that they've got a ready reason why they can't be great.
Right. And I would do it, but.
Yes.
You take away the but.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I just ask these questions, too, because of what you're doing now. I mean, you're teaching Yale. You have something called the McChrystal Group. You're writing another book that's going to capture the essence of some of these ideas, I think. I mean, tell me what this is all about.
Yeah, they're all related because I'm just fascinated by leadership in the current environment. And what I would tell you is my experience in Iraq and reinforced in Afghanistan was that for many, many years, really since Frederick Winslow Taylor came up with scientific management, we worshipped at the altar of efficiency. Really good assembly lines, reductionism to the point where we could break everything down to individual tasks, and if we did those tasks to a high standard, we'd be very efficient, and if we're very efficient, we will be very effective. Well, what I think happened is you can only get the most efficient solution. You can solve for Y, for how much X you need, only if you really know what Y is. And we're in a world now where things are changing so fast, we no longer know what the requirement is for tomorrow, so we can't build a perfect process because we don't know what the output has to be. So the new holy grail, in my view, our view, is adaptability. Building an organization that is organically, automatically designed to be adaptable. It is by necessity designed to look for moving targets, developing good enough solutions constantly to do that. In that vein, two former SEALs who worked for me, and then a young Yale student who was a very bright guy, we are co-writing a book about this system, which we call CrossLead. And it's going to show the history of it, but it's also going to show not just military examples, but business examples and government examples that we've been researching, and some that our firm, McChrystal Group, has been partnering with civilian companies to do. We don't work in any defense or government. We don't do what a lot of people expect ex-military to do. We are partnered with a very different part of the environment and enjoying it.
And I think you and Ann are also part of the Franklin Project, which is what?
The Franklin Project has got me very excited. I believe that citizenship in America has eroded. And I think people tend to think of citizenship as my rights, my entitlements. And I think citizenship is more than voting or paying taxes. I think citizenship is a commitment to the nation and a commitment to other Americans. And so in that regard, I think much comes when you have to commit to something, when you have to sacrifice, when you have to contribute. So what the Franklin Project is designed to do is create the opportunity for every young American between 18 and 28 to do a year of fully funded, with a living stipend, service. Conservation, health care, education, because only military's only needs a certain number. But to give every American that kind of experience for a year, serving with people from Brooklyn or San Diego or you name it, in areas that allow them to work together, force them to work together, but also at the end of that year, they will have sacrificed a bit, they will have contributed a bit, they will have helped build something, and I think that will ultimately change how they view themselves as citizens. And so we're well into our effort. We've got a big summit planned in June at Gettysburg to really capture the spirit of this and move forward, and I'm very excited about it.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
General McChrystal's book is called My Share of the Task. It's a memoir updated with a new preface, and it is now in paperback.